In the last couple of videos, we learned about data types and JSON objects. And in this video, once you learn what APIs are and how to combine all three of these building blocks together, you will be 90% of your way there in learning about AI automations and AI agents. In this video, we're going to learn all about APIs, HTTP requests and responses. You're going to learn how to create them and how do you test them. And we're going to look at a few examples in N8N. So, what are APIs? An API or application programming interface is a way for two computers or two applications to talk to each other over the internet. Right? So it looks something like this. An application on your mobile or your laptop makes an API request to a server, and in return, it gets a response. And think of it no different than a normal telephone call that happens on the internet between websites and applications. You can also think of it in this example where Ash would tell Pikachu to use Thundershock, so it makes a request, and then Pikachu, as the server or the responder, chooses how to respond to that request. And so, what you end up with is a caller or someone asking for data, usually, that is the request, and you have a responder, which is someone giving the data, which is usually the server, also known as a response. So let's look at a practical example. If I visit this website, you can see this contains data about a user called Leanne. It has some of her personal details like email, address, phone, website, and so on. How this request and response works and what APIs are is basically for most data on the internet, you have two options of accessing it. One option is you go to the website and access the data. The second way is to use what is known as an API call. And so, like if we come into N8N and I create a new workflow just to show you this in action, say we just add a manual trigger, and then we had an HTTP request node. So we're going to cover what methods, URLs, authentication is in a bit. But if we copied this same URL across and we pasted it in here and we clicked execute, can you see we've got the same data that we did on this website, right? We have Leanne, all the same information, username, email, address, and so on. But the difference when you're doing it here in your automations in N8N is basically now you can manipulate this data and make decisions based on it, right? Like say you wanted to check what their email was. And if their email belonged to this domain name, say april.biz, then we may want to send them an email to potentially do business or whatever that may be, or you may be applying for a job. And basically, what this allows you to do is rather than having to go through the manual effort of visiting a website and then getting data from it, you can also access most data from websites by using HTTP requests. And we'll get into what the various types are in a bit, but that's basically how you could handle it. So in that example, we have one object, we have one user. But say we wanted to get a list of all the users, because their API documentation allows us to get a list of users. We change this URL to just users. We remove the slash and one. And now if we execute this step, can you see we've got an array? We know it's an array because it starts with an opening square bracket. And we have a list of all these objects. So this is our first user. This is our second user, and so on. And so we get a list of users. And rather than having to have manually done this through their website or by any other means, we now have all this data ready for us to use, clean and readily available in N8N. When you make an API request, API requests aren't native to N8N. Okay, just so that we are clear. API requests you can make from anywhere. There are different tools to use it. Another one that we're going to learn about in this video is Postman, and I'm going to show you how to use Postman to make these API requests. But coming back to what we were talking about is that basically API requests, you can think of it as going to their website or manually doing something is kind of like ordering it in store, versus using an API is kind of like ordering it over the phone. Most APIs in the world are RESTful, and what that means is they follow a set of rules or constraints known as representational state transfer, and this has been the de facto standard for API development since the early 2000s. RESTful APIs, basically what they do is they organize data into a bunch of unique URLs or URIs, and you can think of these as, say, separate phone numbers or separate URLs, right? Because say you wanted all the companies that were available, there would be a unique link to get all the company data. Say you wanted all the users that we just saw, that would have its own URL. If you wanted a specific user, that would be its own URL, right? So you can think of each of these as a unique phone number that you would otherwise call for some specific information you are looking for. And if you didn't know which number to call, you would use like a phone directory. And in each case, like each website has its own API documentation where you can see like how do you request for data and what response can you expect. So an example of this is similarly in a phone directory, how you would have a country code. Here you may have like a type of request, which indicates to the server, are you trying to get data? Are you trying to post or send data? And there are different types of requests, but basically it would be some kind of indication as to what type of request this is. Same how we have a phone number in our traditional phone calling example. Here we have unique URLs or unique URIs, each of which fetches or consumes or requests for a specific resource. Okay. And similar to when you do make a phone call, the person on the other end of the line may answer with, hello, who is this? Right? And that is basically to verify if you actually know the person you are calling or have you dialed a wrong number. And similarly in API calls, and that's why they're also called API calls, we have this concept of header authentication, which we'll talk about more in the next lesson. But basically, that is kind of a mechanism to ensure that only people with the right permissions can access the right resources. So, if you want data about someone or something, you basically are the client. You make the request to the server, and the server responds to your request, right? So in our same Ash and Pikachu example, Ash makes a request to Pikachu to use Thunderbolt, and then Pikachu responds accordingly. So now in Pikachu's case, Pikachu may actually use Thunderbolt, but if Ash was telling Charizard to use Flamethrower, then that may or may not work. So if you get the Pokemon reference, great. But basically, that's how responses work. And so each request you make has a specific format, right? These are some of the key components of making any request. First, you have the type of request, which is get, post, patch, delete. There's also put, but the two most common ones are get and post, which are mainly used to read data from a server, and post is used to write data. You can also use patch to update, but you could also use post to update, and you could use delete to destroy data, but you could also use post to destroy data as well. We'll look at examples later, but this is just at a high level of the types of requests, and the two most common ones we are going to use are get and post. The second component of every request is the unique URL or URI. So this will be like any other website link, and this would be basically the resource that we are trying to fetch information about. The third key component of any request is headers, which are basically metadata about the request. So this may contain, like, there are numerous fields headers can contain. These are just a few common examples I've included. So one may be like accept, maybe one of the headers, which may have a key value pair. So this is a key value pair like we have normally in JSON. Accept is one type, which may have a value of application/JSON or text HTML to indicate it can handle both JSON and HTML, with a preference for JSON if the server can provide it. Another common header used is X API key or API key, which will usually contain a value or password. More on this when we talk about API header authentication. And similarly, authorization or header authorization method, which uses either a token value or it may have the syntax of bearer followed by the token value, which says like these are my credentials, and that's how you verify if you have access to this resource or not. And the fourth component is a body, which is usually like can be JSON or form data. These are only included in post requests. We do not have them in GET requests. You cannot send data to a server in a GET request. You can only fetch data from the server. If you wanted to send data, you would have to use a post request or some other type of request. So then what happens is the server receives your request message. It executes some code, usually to check some database or fetch external data, like fetch data from other services, and then it sends you a response. And similar to how requests have structures, so do responses. They have three main parts, which are status codes, response headers, and response body. Now, the status codes are basically of three large types. So there are 200 type status codes, which may be 200, 201. There are a list, but these are the most common, where 200 indicates a success, 201 indicates it's been created, and 204 indicates there's no content. 400 is usually used for bad requests, 401 for unauthorized, 403 for forbidden, and 404 not found. So often when you're visiting a website, you may occasionally see, right, 404 not found, like the website or the page you are requesting has not been found. And then we have 500 type errors, which may be 500, 502, 503, and so on. Different status codes indicate different successes or failures. And as like an overarching type, usually if you see 200 status codes, it means everything's good. If you see 400 status codes, it usually means you have messed up. And if you see 500 status codes, it usually means there's something wrong with the server. And so one other thing just to remember about these REST APIs is that they are stateless. And what that means is the two parties, the client and the server, the person making the request and the person or the server responding, they don't need to store any information about each other. Every request response cycle is completely independent from all others. And so where and how do we test APIs? We use a tool called Postman. So if I come into Postman, you will see this interface, right? And we will get into examples in a later module. But in here, you will see that it has this type to choose from. We have our get, post, put, patch, delete, head, and options. These are different types, but the two most commonly used types are get and post. So this is the first component of making any request. Then we have our unique URL in here. Here we can enter our headers, we can enter a key and a value, or any combination of headers that we may have in here. And in here, we can also enter our body. We can enter it as key value pairs, or we could also enter it as JSON by choosing the raw option. So we have a bunch of options to choose from. This is what headers and requests and JSON bodies and types look like. And now I'm just going to show you all of this in action by demonstrating what is a webhook. So a webhook is like a doorbell for your automation. It's an API endpoint to receive any request. And as we know, each request will contain a type, a URL, headers, and body. And instead of you constantly checking, like, is there new data and having some kind of polling architecture, this service kind of rings your doorbell only when something happens, and then your workflow or automation would kick off. So let's look at a quick demo in N8N. So if I just come in here and delete this, if we add a webhook trigger, you can see that by default, we have this URL in here, and we see that the HTTP method is get. It also has this path, which is the last part of this URL, like after webhook test that we can see. We have authentication and we have this respond. In this video, we're going to be talking about the core parameters we were discussing earlier, which is the type. So we can set this to a get. Okay, we have our URL. And now if we click on listen for test event, let me come back in here and just execute this workflow. So in here, if we now come into our node, so in this webhook, if we copy this URL and we click on listen for test event, we can now see that our webhook is listening for an event. And we have this URL, we have the HTTP method. And if we come into Postman and we just create a new request, it's going to be a get request. We're going to paste in our URL. and we're going to click send. And it's going to say message workflow was started. And if we come back into our webhook, now we can see the output has all of this information in it. It has like this header information, which is basically metadata about the request, as we were discussing. And like we can ignore the params and query for now. But if we look at the body is empty, right? Because get requests do not send a body in them. If we were using a post request instead, and now we clicked on listen for test event, firstly, if we don't change this type to post, we're going to get an error. So can you see it says this 404 error? The webhook is not registered, and it may even give you this suggestion like, did you mean to make a post request? So if we come in here and click post and now hit send, we can now see the workflow was started, right? And now we get that this node was executed successfully. Another thing to note here is because this is a post request, we can send data in it as well. So if we come up to our body and see we wanted to send a name and say an ID value. So now if we come back to N8N and we click execute workflow, you can see that it's listening for a test event, or you could click into the webhook and click on listen for test event. And now if I hit send, it's going to say workflow was started. But if I look at the output of this node, now if I come into my body, you can see that it has these values, right, of name and ID of the data that we sent. And so this is a very basic example, but this opens up like so many avenues for you to send data from any client to any server and to basically start your automations. So we saw how to set up a webhook. We learned what a webhook is, how do you set it up in N8N, how do you access it and test it using Postman. We will talk about headers and authentication in the next video. But by now, you should have a good understanding of what APIs are, what requests are, what responses are, what are status codes, what are the types, what are the key components of a URL, which is the type, the URL, and the headers, and possibly a body if we have post requests. And that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.